Cereal Box presents Remade. Season 2, Episode 14, Brave New Girl. Written by Amy Rose Capetta. Narrated by Laurel Schroeder. Saya ran faster than she thought her exhausted muscles could. Faster than she had when the caretaker had crashed out of the woods, and all of her shots had missed. She ran and ran. It felt like she'd been doing this forever. Like she'd been born into this remade world, running. In her old life, she'd preferred the kind of activity that told a story, like drama or dance. Running had seemed pointless and empty. The same thing, over and over. And the finish line was just this thing that somebody made up so they could hand out trophies. Now the only trophy was staying alive to do this for another day. Amelia was right about that. Maybe Amelia was right about everything. Saya pounded her feet hard against the ground, but the heartbeat, thump-thump of her feet couldn't cover the horrible, wrenching screams in the distance. Then they stopped. She wanted to feel relieved, but she knew what the lack of screaming probably meant. So she kept running, lighter on the balls of her feet to keep the caretaker from hearing. Her legs were riddled with cramps, her lungs alight. This part of the country, the Midwest, where the gate was supposed to be, so close, just out of reach, was covered in sapling trees. They all looked the same, a faceless collection of maple and beech. In the dark, they were just slashes that she had to weave around, as fast as her throbbing ankles could manage. She touched the energy gun at her waist every 10 steps or so. She discharged so many shots in an aimless frenzy. It was recharging now, with a low-pitched hum. Saya didn't know how long it would take to work itself back up to full strength. She should have tested that before it was a matter of life and death. It heated up slowly as it charged, never hot enough to burn. Just a reminder that it was working. The gun she'd claimed after they'd raided the stash at Sanctuary usually rubbed against the skin where her shirt rode up, making her cold. Now the gun was as warm as a sleeping body. As warm as Inez was when Saya got up for her patrol. She'd rolled over and kissed Saya through a thick frown, which never stopped being cute. Stay. What would you do if I asked you to stay when it was your turn to patrol? Saya had asked. I would tell you to get up and come with me, Inez said, flashing Saya a sleepy smile. Saya's breath clipped short now, as she remembered running a hand through Inez's hair, kissing her long and slow, and then saying, So, come with me. Saya shook her head hard. She shouldn't be thinking about Inez right now. Her father had once told her that when he was out on his beat, he couldn't think about Saya or her mom. He focused on all the other people he was keeping safe, but not them. He would start a running list of all the ways he could lose them, and they could lose him. And then, instead of answering the next call, he would turn in his badge and go straight home. Saya had thought that was a sweet story back in her old life, before she really did lose her parents, and they'd lost her. Before she was born again into a life where she understood exactly how her dad felt. It didn't matter how tired Saya got, or how much she wanted to believe the caretaker had forgotten about her. She couldn't lead it back to camp. She decided she would run another 3 of these ragged circles before she would let herself even think of going back. 1 circle later, her knees knocked painfully with each step. 2 circles, and she could only look up at the stars, because if she looked down at her feet, she would stop. 2.5 circles. She heard a soft rustle, but it could have been the wind, which was like a living thing in this flat part of the country. According to Holden, they had to be getting close to the gate. How could she walk for 3 months since leaving Sanctuary? Get this close, only to be attacked? 3 circles. She had gotten to the stupid finish line, and her body stopped without her mind really giving it permission. That was exactly what the caretaker had been waiting for. It burst from behind the trees, sliding toward her at strange angles, its red eyes catching the last of the setting moonlight, She turned the recharged pulse gun at it and shot. Once. Twice. The beams flew straight for it, but the caretaker leapt, as if it had anticipated her moves. She and the others had gotten better at fighting caretakers, but it looked like the machines had been learning too. The caretaker took a huge leap and landed right in front of her. Saya shot point blank. The gun clicked. Out of charge. The caretaker slashed at her with one of its metal legs. She didn't feel pain at first, only a sort of warm rush. Then she looked down and found that her right leg had burst open at the thigh, bleeding everywhere. Her left leg had taken the end of the gash, stung with a thin line of blood. But her right leg? She stared at it. That wasn't fixable. The caretaker ran off, crashing back into the brush, not caring about stealth anymore, now that it believed it had killed her. It probably had. She expected to be afraid, more afraid than she'd been in her life, but all she felt was a strange mix of two things: simple understanding and exhaustion. Her leg gave out, and she fell backward, skinning her shoulder on the bark of a tree on the way down. Somehow that bothered her more than her leg. Like adding a little bit of extra pain right now was what put the whole thing over the top. She rested one hand on her chest and stared up at the sky. At the stars. So many of them, leaking the last of their light before the sun rose. The last time Saya had been stuck on her back for this long, she had just been remade. This time, she was dying. It wasn't like in the car, with Holden. That had been a single heartbeat so sharp, it felt like being shot from the inside. Twice. The truck had been driving fast, and Saya barely had time to grab the door handle and brace herself before light and pain swallowed her all at once. This time, she could feel exactly how much it hurt. This time she knew exactly how much she was losing. Her heartbeat dimmed in her chest, and she could only feel her pulse in her leg, like it was the sole living part of her, instead of the part that was killing her. She tried to focus on that pulse, and not the fiery ring of pain around it. She stuffed her wrist in her mouth and bit down, so she wouldn't shout and give herself away, wouldn't draw that caretaker back to finish the job, or bring all of its friends down on her family. That was what they were at this point. Big and dysfunctional, and dying way too fast. But they were her family. It reminded her of how her parents had taken in Robbie when he didn't have anyone else in town. You made your family out of the people who were there, the ones who needed you. The ones you started to need in ways you never expected. There was sweet Hiram, and quiet, steady Gabe, and May with her worries that kept them all alive. When she let herself consider the hurt of leaving Inez and Holden, the girl she had fallen in love with, and the boy who had become her best friend, a hope came as bright as the sun that toyed with one edge of the sky. Maybe she could be remade again, like Jingwei. Maybe she would find them all again. But Jingwei had told Saya and the rest that nobody else could be remade. And even if she was, her life here had changed her so much. If she lost it, she would never be the same person again. She gritted her teeth against a fresh rush of pain. She tried to be thankful for it. This was just like the screaming that had trailed her through the woods. A lack of pain wouldn't mean she was better. It would mean she was done. "I can't believe you voted to kill one of us," Saya muttered to her feet. She had been practicing the line for at least 2 days, since they started walking away from Cole. She couldn't decide if she wanted to say it to Holden or Inez first. Walking toward the gate, while all of the caretakers rushed in the same direction, wasn't exactly stress-free, and she didn't want to make things worse, dragging along problems that they should have left behind. Unfortunately, someone had already picked up on her feelings. "You're upset about Cole, aren't you?" Hiram asked, trotting slightly to walk with Saya. Talon flew above him, tracking Hiram's movement. Saya remembered when the baby Cumberbatch was small enough to perch on Hiram's shoulder. She also remembered when Hiram didn't come with an Alex-shaped shadow, walking a few steps behind, kicking at the path. It didn't take a genius to know that Hiram and Alex must have voted to keep Cole with them. Saya didn't feel like she had to hold back when she spoke to them. "I hate that we left him behind," she said. It felt like every step they took formed a ravine that they would never be able to cross back over. "Please stop talking about Cole," May called back. "Why?" Saya asked, slightly irritated that May was censoring a conversation she hadn't even been invited to. "He was one of us." "But he didn't want to be," Nevaeh said with surprising bitterness as they hacked their way through a thick stand of briars. She slashed at the thorns with a long knife from the weapons cache at Sanctuary. Saya had always thought of Nevaeh as the sweet mom type. Helpful, even when help was completely unwanted. But maybe she was changing. Maybe they all were. "If you talk about Cole, then we have to think about Cole," May said. "You mean how he's going to die because we left him there?" Amelia asked. Saya wished she would shut up, but that wasn't exactly fair. Amelia was only saying what Saya had been thinking a minute ago. Leaving Cole behind, even with a keeper, was a death sentence. They all knew that. "We did the right thing," Inez said, falling back a little in the ranks so she could walk alongside Saya. She pinched her arm around Saya's waist and removed it before Saya could feel any real comfort. "The necessary thing." "Maybe don't mix those two up," Sebastian said. May, who was walking at the head of the party, spun on a heel and whisked a finger between Amelia and Sebastian. "Would you two just disappear in the woods again?" she asked. "I thought your antics were giving me a headache before, but this is so much worse. Playing devil's advocate is for people who have nothing better to do. And believe me, if we're going to make it to the gate and figure out how to bring back the rest of the human species, we are busy. So if you can't stop bothering people, go bother each other instead." Amelia cocked an eyebrow at Sebastian, like maybe that wasn't such a bad idea. Inez looked between the two of them and snorted. Saya tried to pretend she didn't rage with jealousy whenever the two of them snuck off. She and Inez hadn't kissed since the roof of the caretaker depot. She looked over at Inez, whose beauty was inescapable with the sun behind her, melting along the edges of her dark hair and washing her skin with gold. Inez turned back to make sure that everyone behind them was keeping up. She gave Hiram a nod that made him walk almost twice as fast. Saya realized two things simultaneously. One, she couldn't stop staring at Inez. Two, Holden wasn't staring at her. She couldn't really say she was grateful for their time apart and the nightmare the others had gone through in Sanctuary. But she was relieved to think that Holden might be able to see her as a person now, and not expect her to be some minor goddess. "Hey," she said. "Holden, wait up." Holden nodded to Saya as she fell into step beside him, in the middle of the column of walkers. Saya took a deep breath. She told herself to be brave, like her mom. She had always been good at speaking her mind, even when she knew what she said wouldn't be popular. "I can't believe you voted to kill one of us." Holden stepped to the side of the path and pulled Saya with him. He let the rest of the group walk on, waiting until they had something like privacy before he turned to her. "I didn't." Saya's mind spun in a complete circle. "Wait, you forced that vote? You put us through all that, and then you changed your mind?" "I thought you'd be proud of me," Holden said, sounding genuinely stung. "I figured out it was the wrong thing to do." Saya sighed. "I am proud of you. Maybe not for the vote, but you kept everyone alive in Sanctuary." "Not everyone," Holden mumbled. Saya's memories of Umta hit her all at once, so strong that they cut her pace in half. Umta had been there right at the start, with Holden and Saya, showing them the way to survive. They were going to have to do it by themselves now, without Umta's honed instincts and motherly ways, keeping them safe from their own bad ideas, as much as she defended them from a hostile world. "At least this time she didn't lose her kids," Saya said, thinking of her own parents with a hard swell of loss. I think she was happy to have another chance with us." I don't know if happy was in Umta's vocabulary, Holden said. I think happiness came after humans could stop fighting so hard to get through every single day. Surviving was the best thing Umta knew how to do. And she saved us, Saya said, but her smile felt weak and breakable. We survived. A squawk rose from above them. Talon must have spotted something on the horizon. Of course, he squawked at anything. It could be another set of Cumberbatches flying in the opposite direction. A tasty squirrel for Talon's lunch. Or it could be caretakers gaining on them. Holden nodded at Saya, and they both got back on the path without another word, picking up the pace. Saya's legs ran with a trickle of sweat, but she couldn't shake the cold certainty Holden's words had left in her. If the best thing a person could do was survive, eventually they would fail. Saya woke up, warm and wet, and it took her a half-second to realize she was stranded in a pool of her own blood. It had spread from her leg, up her back, and crept all the way to her neck. Her ponytail was slick and matted with blood. When she held up her hands, they were printed darkly red. Saya started laughing. There was no humor in the sound, only a frantic sort of certainty. Amelia had been right. Blackness thrust its fingers into her vision, but Saya blinked it away. She took a good, clear-eyed look at her leg. It had been cut down to the bone. If she hadn't died from blood loss yet, maybe she had enough time to get back to camp. She crawled on 3 of her limbs, dragging the 4th. First, she vomited from the pain. Then she started to cry. But she didn't let herself scream. She had been mentally complaining about running only a few hours ago. It had felt like an endless nightmare she would never wake up from. Now moving that quickly, and without pain, seemed like a far-off, untouchable dream. She knew she would probably never see the gate, or what happened when they got there. Whether they brought the rest of humanity back from wherever they'd gone to, or followed in their footsteps and used the wormhole to leave Earth behind. Saya would never have to worry about a choice that big or daunting again. The rest of her life broke down to hours, minutes, final breaths. She let herself think about all the reasons she wanted to reach camp. She pictured saying goodbye to Hiram, whose eyes would probably dot with tears, and Holden, who would pretend she was going to get better until the last possible second, when he had to accept the truth. And Sebastian. She had to see Sebastian. Inez was harder to think about. Saya wanted Inez's last memory of her to be a happy one. Maybe that time they stopped at the side of the road, and Inez leaned over and kissed her for no reason. Right in front of everyone. Her eyes never seemed to run out of tears. Her body seemed to contain an endless supply of pain. She crawled for what felt like hours, but she finally made it back to the outskirts of camp. It couldn't have been too long, in reality, because the sun was just risen and barred by the sapling trees, the light broken. Her breath came with threads of spit, and she panted so hard it felt like she was screaming. She worried that she would have to wake someone up, but Loki was skirting the edges of the camp, his movements jerky and worried. For once, Saya thought paranoia looked good on him. As soon as he noticed her, he ran at top speed, gravely taking in her leg without saying a thing about it. He knew how bad it was, and he wasn't going to pretend it away or lie to her. Saya had never understood how great Loki was before. He'd seemed like Holden's scowling shadow, but now Saya could see that he knew just how to respond to certain things, ones that would have sent anyone else into a ruthless spin. "I love you," she said, blinking hard as she coughed up spit. "Oh, man," he said. "You really are messed up." He grabbed her under the arms and hoisted her to standing. She had to balance precariously against his chest. When she accidentally put the tiniest bit of weight on her other foot, in a reflexive attempt to balance, the sound that she'd been holding back came out all at once, a ferocious scream. That woke the whole camp up quickly enough. People swarmed around her, their faces backlit by the bright morning sun. They all looked so beautiful. and terrified. Their voices overlapped in a way that made Saya's head swim. Gabe and Loki picked her up and set her down again, carefully, as if they were afraid to break her. She almost laughed. They were being so delicate, now that the caretaker had already torn her apart. "It's clotting, which is good, but I think she lost a lot of blood," Nevaeh whispered. "And her leg—" "You don't need to whisper," Saya said, her voice stronger than she expected it to be. "I know what's happening." She could handle this. She knew she could. Now that all of them were with her, she could be brave enough to die. That was when Inez broke through the ranks. Saya's face crumpled, and she knew from Inez's blank stare exactly what this was doing to her. Inez had lost Teddy, the person she cared about most, to a caretaker. She'd watched him die. And Saya had fought all the way back here, just so it could happen again. "I'm sorry," she said, digging each word out of a massive pile of pain. It was an effort just to breathe. She remembered playing a death scene once in drama class. She hadn't known how to act, lying there on the uncomfortable wooden boards of the stage, looking up at everyone's looming faces. The teacher had said she looked like a wilted stalk of celery. He said she had to put more feeling into it. Saya had wanted to say that she couldn't really act a convincing death scene because she had no idea what it felt like to die. It turned out it felt a lot like acting through a death scene. More awkward than epic. More wilted and sad than anything else. "No," Inez said, running her fingers over Saya's face and shoulder, the only parts of her that weren't covered in blood. "Don't be sorry. Sorry means you're dying, and you are not dying." "You stole Holden's line," Saya said with a dry, burning cough. "Inez is right," Holden said, taking Saya's hand on the other side. "That does happen sometimes." There was no edge in Holden's voice, and when Inez's and Holden's stares met over Saya's body, they didn't glare like rivals. They were sharing the pain of this moment. The way they were living, always running. It was inevitable. They were going to die, picked off one by one. Saya's throat was too dry. Her breath was too thin. Inez cupped her cheek and half smiled at her. Saya closed her eyes, expecting the softness of a last kiss. She waited in a painful silence, until Inez started to scream. Saya opened her eyes to see Inez drawing the gun from her thigh holster. Heart raging in her chest, Saya turned to see what was happening, certain for a terrible half-second that she'd led the caretakers back to their camp. But it was a keeper causing the commotion, one that had been with them since the depot. It looked a little bit like Shiny Friend, which put Saya slightly more at ease, until she realized that it was charging at her, its largest red eye looking straight into hers. Inez blocked its path with her body, as the keeper lashed out with its metal legs. More screaming. Pain melted Saya's thoughts. The hurt of leaving Cole behind faded the farther they got, returning to Saya in sharp, jagged moments. The group had been walking away from him, toward Lake Michigan and the gate, for 3 solid weeks when Inez took Saya aside. "Do you want to patrol with me tonight?" Inez asked. Yes?" Saya had been waiting for a moment like this, but she hadn't wanted to push things. Well, she had, but she hadn't known how to do it without stopping their progress to the gate. And then there was the memory of Cole, always worming its way back into her mind at the worst possible moment. When they made up the patrols for the night, Inez nudged the plans until she and Saya were somehow together. Inez flashed her a quick smile when nobody was paying attention, and they fell asleep on opposite sides of the camp. When the time came, Inez shook her awake, looking down with a softness in her eyes that nobody else got to see. A softness that Saya loved as much as the badass version of Inez, the one who made her feel invincible. That badass voted to leave someone behind, Saya reminded herself. She slid out from under Inez's gaze, shook off the lingering heaviness of waking up, and got to patrolling. It was a particularly quiet night, but she forced herself to scan the brush for signs of caretakers. Saya wondered, not for the first time, how many groups of caretakers were headed to the gate, just like they were. Had every caretaker in the country heard the signal from Sanctuary? Or just the ones nearby? Could they communicate with one another, caretaker to caretaker, like the keepers did? Or was something else sending them signals, giving them orders, controlling them? After an hour of dutiful patrolling, Saya dropped herself onto a fallen log. "I'll get up in a minute," she said. "I promise. I'm just 17 different kinds of tired." This version of Earth is exhausting. Inez joined her on the log, leaving a few unnecessary inches between them. Although I was pretty tired before we were remade too. "I'm just so tired of waiting for things to be safe," Saya said, the words leaking out before she could stop them. "Yeah, I don't ever see that happening," Inez said, casting her glance around the woods, like a caretaker might have heard them talking. But they were alone. At least, for now. "I mean, there's never gonna be a great time. For this." Saya felt a smile sneak onto her face, past all of her defenses. "And what, exactly, is this?" Inez kissed her. And kissed her. Inez's hands moved over her sweaty skin and sore muscles, and made her feel beautiful in a way that she never had, back when she had cute clothes and regular showers. She kissed Inez, and had no real intention of stopping. After one particularly long and involved kiss, Inez shook her head with what looked like blissful disbelief and rested her forehead against Saya's shoulder. "This whole thing doesn't add up," Inez said. "We can't be here together. You and me. I don't get to be that lucky." "Lucky?" Saya asked. The word felt like a Band-Aid that Inez had ripped off, only to show Saya that the wound underneath it had healed. There were good things about this new life, even if it included such a high proportion of running for their lives. There were good things, even if Saya still missed her parents, and always would. Inez squinted at Saya, looking playful and serious at the same time. "Would you ever have dated me? I mean, even considered dating me, if we met in our old lives?" One of the strange things that had happened after Cole's trial was that people had started talking about their old lives again. He'd stirred everybody up. Cole hadn't been able to see further than his past. It was like a fog he'd walked around in. Trapped. Nobody wanted that fog around them now. "I couldn't really be myself in that life," Saya said. "Not all of myself. I'm sure it wasn't 100% awful to be hot and popular and universally adored," Inez said, her smile teasing and tender at the same time. Saya decided to play along. It felt good to be talking about something other than weapons and caretakers and getting to the gate. "You were hot before we were remade too," Saya said, crossing her arms with a flourish. A blush worked its way up to her cheeks. "It's not like the caretakers gave you a new body when they brought you back. You were, definitely hot." "You're just saying that because I showed up in a cheerleader outfit," Inez said, with a challenging quirk of the eyebrow. "Cheerleaders aren't, like, a thing for me," Saya mumbled. This was ridiculous. No one else, boy or girl, had ever made her feel as wordless and breathless as Inez did. "Would you have given me a second look before?" she added, discovering as she was saying the question out loud that she actually needed to know. "I'm your only option now. The past was like a lesbian buffet." "Did you really just say lesbian buffet?" Inez asked, with a laugh that probably could have alerted anyone in a half-mile to their presence. Saya had never really seen Inez let go, be anything less than careful. It looked good on her. Stunning, in fact. But it was Saya's turn to worry. Even if the night seemed perfectly quiet and still, there could be caretakers anywhere. Saya grabbed Inez's wrist and ran her fingers lightly over Inez's palm. "I'm making a point," she said in a low voice. Do you think differences in who we were before really matter now? Inez slid her fingers up Saya's sides as they kissed. Saya wanted to melt into the feeling and forget everything else, but she couldn't. The harder she tried to drown herself in kissing, the more her breath turned to a nervous gasp. Inez pulled away slightly. Are you okay? What's wrong? Saya shook her head, like she could chase the words out of it. I know you care about me, but if something bad happens, you would leave me, she said. You would leave me behind. What are you talking about? Inez asked, shifting so far back that all Saya wanted to do was reach for her. But she'd started this, and she had to get through it, or this moment would keep chasing them. You left Cole. The guy wanted to be left, Inez cried, indignant. He didn't want to be one of us. He was having a problem, and he wanted to solve it by killing Umta. You would never let anyone else get hurt because of you, so this isn't even an argument. Saya took a deep breath. I think I need to hear you say it. I would never leave you behind, Inez said, reaching for Saya's waist. She let herself be held, but when Inez moved to kiss her, Saya pulled back. Even if something bad happened? She asked. Especially then, Inez promised. The worst kind of bad? There is literally nothing that could be bad enough, Inez said staunchly. I wouldn't want to keep going without you. Relief finally slid into Saya. She put her arms around Inez's neck, running one thumb over the fine curls there. Now that the fear in her chest had eased, a different one built in its place. She kissed Inez, settling her hands on Inez's shoulder blades and pulling Inez as close to her as she possibly could. When she couldn't get them any closer, and she still needed more, she stopped kissing Inez for a second and pressed her lips together. When she spoke, her voice sounded small, but at least she was in charge of it. She was driving the car this time. Do you want to pull in Amelia and Sebastian? Inez finished. Hell yes. I didn't think you'd be okay with shirking our duties. I can kiss you and listen for caretakers at the same time, Inez said. I'm multi-talented. We'll see about that, Saya said. The smirk that rose to her face surprised her as much as it seemed to delight Inez. She tugged Inez's hand and turned to look for a good spot for, well, everything. Then she pulled Inez to her knees and kissed her with a sort of confidence she'd never felt before, except when she was on stage pretending to be someone else. But she wasn't pretending this time. Inez slid her hand up Saya's back, under her shirt. Anticipation crackled all through Saya's body. She drew her long, dark hair aside and pulled her shirt off, as Inez took a very visible swallow. Saya wondered for a second if her old self ever would have been this bold. It only took her a second to decide, no. But maybe that was the point. Maybe, if they were brave enough, they got to find something new in the middle of all this pain. Pain woke Saya up, called her back to reality. A hot, constant throb in her thigh. She looked down. Her leg was gone. Inez and Alex were sitting on either side of Saya, Holden and Loki hovering together nearby. But when she opened her eyes, the caretaker who reminded her of Shiny Friend was the first one to notice. The keeper clattered closer to Saya, the others hanging back behind it. Hey, Inez said to the keeper, using her arm to bar access to Saya. Stay back, okay? It saved her life, Inez, Alex said. Maybe, Inez said, but I'm still pissed at it for the bum rush. Listen, Saya croaked, her throat dry. Inez and Alex turned to Saya, Inez's face lighting up like Saya had personally made the sun rise. You would never let anyone else get hurt because of you. We have to move, Saya said. That caretaker that attacked me, there must be more nearby. Even if I didn't lead it back to the camp, they'll find us if we don't. Inez and Alex both nodded. Alex looking nervous, and Inez mostly just thrilled that Saya had woken up. Let's pack and move, Inez said, stirring everybody up. Saya turned to Alex. What did the keeper... how did it... She didn't really know how to phrase the question about what had happened while she slept. How Shiny the Second had saved her. Alex seemed to understand, his head bobbing in a deep nod. Yeah, the keeper came at you because it must have known you were about to... Bleed out? Saya asked. She didn't really have time to be delicate. Right, Alex said. And he used one of the sharp ends of his arms to cut, and then sort of looked to Sparky, who came over and used his blue flame to heat the end of the other keeper's leg so it could cauterize the wound. It was all pretty cool. Except for the part where Saya's leg was gone, and now they had to leave camp at top speed. She caught sight of movement on the other side of the camp. Talon rose in a rush of big leathery wings and flew above them, probably for the morning hunt that he liked to start each day with. He can't do that, Saya shouted, the words ripping out of her. He'll show the caretakers where we are. Talon! Hiram Whisper shouted, patting his knee like the dragon really was his dog. Talon, come back here! The Cumberbatch circled once and dove back to the ground, although his pinched face gave Hiram a not very pleased look. Sebastian and Sunita are still out in the woods looking for Amelia, Holden said. We have to wait until they get back. Amelia? Saya had been so messed up when she'd staggered into camp that she hadn't been able to tell them what happened. She forced a dry swallow. Call them back, she said. Now. Even if they found what they were looking for, they wouldn't be happy about it. The horrible, wrenching screams in the distance. All right, Holden said, reading how serious Saya was. Loki, do you mind going out to find the search party? Loki gave Holden the kind of trusting nod that Saya assumed came from spending so much time together in Sanctuary, and he rushed off into the woods. The rest of the group pulled their things together, whispering to one another and shooting Saya nervous glances like she was behind a hospital window and not sitting right near them. Inez slid into place at Saya's side, offering her shoulder so Saya could stand. She battled to her feet, her knee almost giving out with the attempt to carry her weight without anything on the other side to relieve it. She couldn't balance easily, and walking was pretty much impossible. A flare of nerves exploded all the way down her leg. Not the one she was standing on. The missing one. A whimper escaped from Saya's lips, and Inez stroked the back of her neck. Her words came back to Saya in a tangle. I would never leave you behind. You would never let anyone else get hurt because of you. Those statements contradicted each other now. I'll never be able to keep up with you. You have to leave me behind, or they'll... Hiram appeared with a handful of willow bark. He said he had found some along the walk and remembered, from his scout days, that it had pain relief properties. Though up to now, they'd only been using it for basic pains and headaches. Chew this, he said. It should help a little. Thanks, Saya said. She put it in her mouth and almost spat it back out. Its bitterness seeped down her throat. Holden and Inez had more or less rounded everyone up, and now Holden approached her carefully. She got the feeling she knew what he was going to ask next. Saya, do you know where Amelia is? Saya chewed the bark until it was a tasteless mush, and the ache in her muscles eased slightly. But nerve pain still shot through her missing leg, unrelenting. Saya? Inez asked, softly. Saya closed her eyes and started talking. The night before, she and Amelia had been paired on patrol together, the pre-dawn shift. When Saya shook herself awake and Inez grumbled about it, Saya almost asked Inez to come with her. She thought about giving Amelia some ridiculous excuse and sneaking off with her girlfriend, just like Amelia had snuck off with Sebastian so many times. But Saya and Inez had patrolled together a few nights in a row, and as much as the memory of kissing made her want more, she knew they needed to be more alert than ever tonight. They were close now to Lake Michigan and the gate, and if large numbers of caretakers had gone to the same place, Saya would need to be listening for metal in the brush, not the sound of Inez's breath in her ear. Saya kissed Inez's frown, stole some of her sleepy warmth with a quick hug, and left her to fall quickly back into her dreams. She would tell Saya about those dreams in the morning. Usually, her family had all drowned at the same time, and they were all remade together. Sometimes Inez was dragging them through the woods, away from caretakers, while they argued about small business loans. Sometimes she was helping her mom open the first taqueria in Arcadia, but no one wanted to eat there because baby cumberbatches had started roosting on the tables. Sometimes Teddy was helping them cross a river, teaching her nephew how to swim. Saya's nightly dreams about her parents had stopped a while ago. She still thought about them, and they slipped into random dreams sometimes, but it wasn't the same constant presence. Inez never let go of anybody, even a little bit. Once they mattered forever. Amelia and Saya walked together through the quiet forest. "When do you think we'll hit the dunes?" Amelia asked. Today they had seen the first breaks in the cover that meant the dunes weren't far. Sebastian, who was from Chicago and had been on the eastern side of the lake a few times, remembered them from his childhood. But he couldn't remember exactly how far they were from the water, and of course the world had changed a lot. "I don't know," Saya said. "I hope we don't have too much company," Amelia muttered. She fiddled with the pulse gun on her belt. She was one of the kids who still couldn't get a decent shot when they practiced, even though she'd been a military brat in her old life. Saya wasn't bad at it. Her dad had taken her to the shooting range a few times. But she still had an aversion to guns. She knew her dad had hated that he had to carry one for work. He had trained Saya because he wanted her to be able to protect herself in an emergency. Now, her whole life qualified as an emergency. "Do you want some tips on using that?" Saya asked Amelia, gesturing at the gun. "Ugh, I hate this thing," she said. "Necessary evil," Saya said, quoting her dad. "Yeah, that's the problem," Amelia said. "We're not really changing anything, are we?" Saya blinked hard a few times, trying to chase off the last of how tired she felt. She heard a slight rustle behind them, but when she turned around, there was no movement in the trees. "What do you mean?" Amelia's freckles twisted out of shape as she grimaced. "One reason Sebastian and I are always running off together is that we know we're running to something good for once. The rest of it is all the same. Arcadia, Sanctuary, the gate. The gate is important," Saya said automatically. "If what the Keepers told us is true, we can bring the rest of the humans back." "To what?" Saya blinked hard again, but this time it had nothing to do with exhaustion. Okay, a little to do with exhaustion, but mostly with not having a good answer. The Keepers want the humans back, but if we bring them to a planet overrun with caretakers who want them dead, it's just one more mess. We're always running to something or away from something, and we're never solving any of the problems. I'm tired of it." "Me too," Saya said softly. "But what can we do?" The rustle came again, this time from slightly behind them and off to the left. Saya pivoted fast, her pulse gun drawn. "Wow, you really are trigger-happy, aren't you?" Amelia asked. "I just don't want to take any chances," Saya muttered, thinking about Inez waiting for her, sleepy and warm, back at camp. Amelia took a deep breath. "Anyway, I think we should—" The brush exploded, and the gleam of a caretaker's metal body filled Saya's view. She had just reholstered her pulse gun, and her fingers fumbled to draw it again. The caretaker grabbed Amelia from behind in a sharp embrace. Amelia's eyes went wide. Saya had never seen so much of the whites. "Run!" Amelia shouted. Saya got the pulse gun out and fired off a wild set of shots. Then she breathed once, deeply, and actually found her aim. 2 shots hit the caretaker's shell, but didn't seem to pierce it. The caretaker turned toward her. Amelia was bleeding and screaming. "Go!" Saya did what she had to do, but every step away, leaving Amelia behind, felt wrong. Amelia's screams followed her through the woods. She told herself that as long as Amelia was still screaming, there was hope. Saya watched Holden and Sebastian from across the camp. Holden had told Saya that he would take care of everything, that she'd already been through so much. But Saya felt sick, letting someone else tell Sebastian that Amelia was never coming back. Sebastian's face went blank, then flooded with disbelief. And then he announced, for everyone to hear, "I'm going back. I'm not leaving her to those fucking caretakers." "She's gone, Sebastian." "You don't know that!" he screamed. "No," Saya said quietly. "But I do." She might not have seen Amelia die, but she had seen the way the caretaker had grabbed her, dragged her. She'd heard the screams, and the way they reached a fevered pitch right before they stopped. "We can't lose anyone else, and we can't get into a standoff this close to the gate," Holden said. "We have to go." He tried to put an arm around Sebastian's shoulders, but the other boy shrugged him off violently. He gave Saya dark looks as they left camp. She added guilt to the pile of pain. Gabe had been assigned to help Saya walk, but her phantom limb was only getting worse. Not even an hour out of camp, she faltered. "Let's take a few minutes," Inez said, rushing back to her. "Are you kidding?" May asked. "We can't stop just because your girlfriend is tired," Sebastian said, his voice cold. "We're all tired," Holden admitted. "But, yeah, we should probably keep moving." "Way to herd those kids. Catch her in the post-apocalyptic rye," Loki muttered. "I'm pretty sure we're all tired is a stupid argument to make when one of us can barely walk in the first place," Inez said. "So unless all of us suddenly have one leg instead of two, yeah, no." "Point taken," Holden said. "Saya, are you okay?" "I'd be more okay if you all weren't talking about me like I'm a broken-down machine." Jingwei stood on a rock, balanced on her toes. Of all the things that were happening, seeing Jingwei move so easily made Saya the most upset. She missed being able to balance without thinking about it. Saya felt tears heat her eyes, and she smeared them away before they dropped. Saya was going to be left behind, just like Cole. Her breath came in uncontrolled gasps, and soon they were all staring at her, and she couldn't control that either. "I can keep going," she lied through a rush of tears. "Maybe there's another way," Inez said. "There has to be." She took a deep breath, and Saya doubted she would ever forget the look in Inez's eyes, the truly desperate one. "The keepers, can they help her?" Saya stared at Inez, shaking her head as she stacked up Inez's words against the many, many comments she had made about never trusting the keepers. On the one hand, it was the last thing she'd ever expected Inez to say. On the other, she believed that Inez would do anything to save her. "How would they do that?" Hiram asked, patting Talon's head, clearly in need of comfort. Saya wouldn't have minded a little comfort at that moment herself. All she felt was a new kind of fear, the kind that came with hope. "Could they?" she asked, her voice weak and tear-stained. Jingwei jumped down from the rock and cocked her head, like she was listening. "The keeper who amputated your leg thinks that it might be possible." "Shiny the second?" Saya said. "Who the hell was Shiny the first?" Inez asked. Shiny the second approached Saya, looking nervous, almost shy. It stared at her, like it was doing some quick calculations. Jingwei walked around Saya in a circle, cocking her head in a way that clearly meant she was listening to the keepers. "It thinks it can come up with a sort of new leg for you." "Like a prosthesis?" Nevaeh asked, her words spiking with hope. Saya's heart did the same, even though it seemed a little too good to be true. Besides, if it was really that simple, why hadn't the keepers done it right away? "Yeah, a prosthesis," Jingwei said. But, Saya asked. "Well, they would have to make it out of themselves," Jingwei said. "Disassemble and pull the parts out of their own anatomy. I've seen them do this before. It's actually really cool. I mean, they use their limbs to recombine." "Yes," Saya said, interrupting her before she could lose her nerve. "Yes." Holden looked at Saya, a worried dent between his eyes. Are you sure? We can help you walk. We're not far from the gate now. You don't need to do this. Yeah, but there are going to be caretakers everywhere, and we don't know what else we'll run into, and I'll never make it to the gate without help. There's no running from the problem anymore. Inez grabbed her wrist. Holden nodded. Saya took a deep breath and stared into the mirrored eye of Shiny the Second. I'm all in. The rest of the kids walked ahead. Saya insisted on it. They took 2 of the keepers with them, in case they ran into a fight on the dunes. Sparky, Shiny the Second, and a keeper with 10 sharp legs stayed behind. Saya thought of that one as Leggy. If the caretakers catch up to us, the keepers will protect me, Saya said. I can stay with you and translate, Jingwei said. Saya shook her head. She didn't really want anyone else there. We'll catch up soon, and if we don't... Run? Sunita said. Saya was starting to hate that word. Sometimes it felt like it was the only one in the whole remade world. She gave her silent promise to Amelia. They would change things. Really change them. People started to leave, shooting Saya glances over their shoulders. May and Gabe, and Sunita and Loki first. Sebastian stayed behind and whispered in her ear. I hope you die. You don't really mean that, Saya said. She knew enough about pain now to understand that this was just a fresh wound. If she had died instead of Amelia, Inez would be a violent wreck. But when Sebastian answered her by spitting on the ground, Saya still shivered as he walked away. Hiram left a little stack of willow bark. Thanks, Saya said, giving Hiram's wrist a squeeze. Hiram took a few steps, waiting for Talon to come with him. But he stayed at Saya's side, looking nervous but loyal, the way she remembered dogs being when they could sense that a human needed comfort. Don't worry, Saya said. I'll make sure Talon gets back to you. Holden and Inez were the last 2 left. Obviously. Holden gave her a hug, burying his face in her shoulder like he might be able to make this all disappear. It's okay, she said. It's not like I'm going to an evil bunker or anything. Ha ha, Holden said. We'll stop as soon as we see the gate. Only if it's safe, Saya argued. We'll give you a chance to catch up. We have to. And then he got up and left too, quickly, like he didn't trust himself not to look back. Inez settled Saya into a comfortable lying down position. It's just surgery, Saya said. Yeah, with keeper MDs. I mean, I know I'm the one who suggested that they help you, but... How many times will they save us before you trust them? Saya asked. If they keep saving your life, I'll ride one like a parade float and call myself Miss Metal Lover 3089, or whatever year it is. Inez bent over Saya, the ends of her dark hair sweeping over Saya's skin. Inez kissed her and left. I would never leave you behind. Saya knew she told Inez to do it. So why did it still call up an instant, worried ache? The 3 keepers gathered around her, a small group of metallic new friends. Saya's stomach convulsed with nerves. I'm ready, she said, in case they were waiting on her cue to start. The keepers moved around her, filled with energy and feverish purpose. They measured her with tiny pinprick touches, then compared their arms and legs. After so much anticipation that Saya's nerves doubled, everything went still. Then a flurry of movement. Sparky used his internal blue sparks to ignite one of his legs into a sort of blowtorch, with which he removed several of the keeper's limbs. Dividing those into smaller pieces, Sparky then soldered 2 of the largest sections to create a joint, which Saya imagined would work like a knee. Saya was so fascinated that for a few moments she forgot to be scared. But when Shiny the Second approached her with the creation, she started to shake. Her eyes closed involuntarily, and she bit down on the bark Hiram had given her. She screamed as metal pierced the recently cauterized wound on her leg, and she thought it would only get worse. She prepared to black out for the duration. But then she opened her eyes again to see Shiny the Second pull away quickly. Sparky lit a blue fuse that Shiny the Second used to reseal the wound. Saya could feel something that Shiny the Second had left behind, small and hard under her skin, irritating but not unbearable. Leggy slid a sort of belt made of metal around her waist and fastened it with a few quick movements. A harness hung down from it, and Leggy slipped the leg they'd created into the harness. Saya could feel it click into place, aligning with the small bit of metal in the base of her missing leg. Magnets. They'd used magnets. She looked down at her shiny new leg. She pushed herself to her feet, or rather, her foot, and the little triangle of metal the keepers had created to steady her and hold her weight on the other side. Putting her weight down caused the knee joint to bend slightly, but it held. It also hurt. "Will I get used to this?" she asked, but the keepers couldn't answer. They just stared at her, looking eager and fascinated. Shiny the Second took a few steps forward, as if wanting to be right there when she used the leg they'd created for the first time. It ached every time she took a step. It reminded her of everything she'd lost. Her parents, her first life, Thomas, Wesley, the first Jingwei, Teddy, Amelia. Parts of herself that she'd taken for granted, that she'd never thought she could lose. But she kept moving, through the pain, even though it made her muscles strain to the snapping point. She needed to catch up to the others. The whole surgery had taken a little more than an hour, and they would be moving fast toward the gate. Saya pushed herself, even though she knew it wasn't a great idea. Soon enough, she broke through the edge of the woods and into the dunes, where sand slid, giving her the first challenge for her new, keeper-created leg. But it had an attachment that spread out in response to the sand, a firm metallic webbing that redistributed her weight and made her able to keep going. The dunes rose and fell, and as she crested a tall one, it gave her a view of the dunes that stretched in front of her, maybe half a mile of them. The water couldn't be far beyond that. She could see Inez and Holden and the rest, walking at the very edge of those dunes. She tried to run, but that wasn't possible. Not yet. "Talon?" Saya said to the Cumberbatch, who'd been flying slightly behind them. She pointed at the group ahead of them. "Hiram, go!" Talon took off in a way that reminded Saya of a puppy bounding, and within 5 minutes, he had closed the distance. As soon as he landed near Hiram, the entire group looked back the way they'd come. Saya waved her arms wildly, and the keepers did the same, mimicking her in a way that made her laugh for the first time in days. Everyone waved back. The other group kept moving, probably looking for cover where they could wait for Saya. She followed for what felt like hours. Long, painful hours. The sunset came on slowly here. Saya caught up to them under a stand of scrubby trees. Inez rushed forward to meet her, their lips meeting, warm, and way too brief. "What?" Saya asked when Inez pulled away. "Is it the gate? Is it not there? Are we still too far? What's wrong?" Inez helped her to the top of the rise. The beach below them was silver, completely covered in caretakers. And beyond that, Lake Michigan stretched all the way to the horizon, with a metallic arch planted in the middle. The skeletons of drowned skyscrapers rose out of the placid water in the distance. "That was Chicago," Sebastian said. His voice had gone from bitter to completely blank. The tops of the dead skyscrapers flickered with light and motion, and it took Saya a second to realize that even those were crawling with caretakers. "Where's the gate?" Saya asked. "Is it on an island, or—" May pointed to a great metallic arch out there in the water. "Doesn't that look like a gate to you?" To be honest, Saya had only registered it as one of the many strange features of the remade world, until May pointed that out. "That's where they left," Saya whispered. "There's got to be a control station. Some way to work it," Holden said, as if they'd already started this argument, and Saya was coming in partway through. Even if there is a control station, how do we get to it? Inez asked. There were caretakers everywhere, completely blocking their path, and the promise that Saya had made to Amelia snapped into place. Saya looked around at her friends, and at the keepers who joined their group. It's not enough to keep running and get picked off one by one. It's not enough to bring humans back to a planet like this. If you want us to bring humanity back, we need to help each other. Sparky cocked his head. We need to stop the rogue caretakers, for good. Okay, but how are we supposed to do that? Hiram asked, looking pale and nervous. Talon squawked to comfort him. And as everyone frantically shushed the Cumberbatch, the caretakers on the beach below swiveled. A wall of metal moving en masse. Is this what you had in mind? May muttered, as everyone reached for their weapons. Not really, Saya admitted. They needed planning and strategy to take down this many caretakers. They would never survive this kind of battle. And there was nowhere left to run. The metallic creatures rushed toward them, a tide of caretakers, and Inez took Saya's hand with her free one. They held their pulse guns tight. Then, from the center of the gate, came a flash of silver light. 1 second, Saya and her friends were alone with hundreds, maybe thousands of caretakers. The next, the caretakers scattered in every possible direction, some of them running up the dunes past the humans without bothering to fight them. The caretakers on the tops of the skyscrapers quickly leapt into the water. What? Inez whispered. Saya waited for relief to set in, but her nerves stayed taut. Anything that made caretakers run like that might be an even worse threat. Look, Holden said, pointing up at the center of the gate. When the silver light faded, it left behind a spaceship that seemed to take up the entire sky. Who's flying that thing? May asked. Or what's flying it? Loki muttered. Who gives a crap? Inez said. That could be our ride out of here. It could help take out the caretakers, Holden said. There's only one way to find out, Saya said, putting her arms in the air and shouting. Holden smiled at her and jumped in the air, taking up the cry, even though Loki crossed his arms and glared with doubt. Jingwei and Inez ran to the highest point they could find and screamed with excitement, and soon almost all of them were doing it. Even if Saya couldn't jump, she could yell at the top of her lungs, trying to call down a real-life spaceship to save them. The sound that poured out of her felt like hope. This has been Remade. Season 2, Episode 14. Brave New Girl. Written by Amy Rose Capetta. Narrated by Laurel Schroeder. Audio produced by Amanda Rose Smith. Musical theme by Amanda Rose Smith. Copyright 2018, Cereal Box Publishing. Production copyright 2018, Cereal Box Publishing.